Welcome to today's webinar, Research Practice Partnership in Law Enforcement with the Chattanooga Police Department. My name is Susan Howley, and I am the Project Director for the Center for Victim Research. The center is built through a partnership between researchers and practitioners at the Justice Research and Statistics Association, the National Center for Victims of Crime, and the Urban Institute. This webinar, it was produced under funding from the Office for Victims of Crime under two different grants. First, the grant that funds the Center for Victim Research, and then the grant that funds the ELERV project at the Chattanooga Police Department. The Center for Victim Research is a one-stop resource for victim service providers and researchers so that you all can connect and share knowledge through our website, our library, a directory, the TA we provide, syntheses, and fellowships. And now it is my very great pleasure to welcome today's presenters. Unfortunately, Chief David Roddy is not able to join us today, but we do have Caroline Huffaker, the Victim Services and Chaplains Coordinator at the Chattanooga Police Department, and Christie Wilder, Dean at the School of Social Work for the Southern Adventist University. I will let Caroline and Christie take it from here and introduce themselves.
Hello everyone, my name is Caroline Huffaker, and as Susan said, I'm the Victim Services and Chaplains Coordinator here at Chattanooga Police Department. On behalf of Chief Roddy, he wanted me just to pass along his gratitude for the opportunity to present about the work that we're doing here at Chattanooga Police Department with SAU. He sends his regrets. We've had some emergencies come up in our department over the last week and is attending to some of those needs in support of our officers and his family at this time. So he does welcome feedback, and his contact information will be at the end of this presentation, so please reach out to him with any questions that you might have.
Good afternoon. I'm Christie Wilder, and as has already been stated, I'm the Dean in the School of Social Work at Southern Adventist University. And I've had the ongoing privilege for the past 3 years, starting on our 4th year, of being the research partner, one of the research partners on the ELERV grant, which you're going to hear more about in just a moment. I have done research projects in other areas. This is actually the first one in the criminal justice arena, victim services. So I've learned a lot, and I'm very excited about being able to share some of what we've learned through our partnership over these past few years. So thanks for joining in.
Christie, this is Susan. If you can speak a little louder, a few people are having trouble hearing you.
Okay. So do you want me to repeat that or just speak louder moving forward?
Just speak louder moving forward. Thanks so much.
Sure, not a problem.
All right. So we'll go ahead and get started. So as Susan said, we wanted to give note to our funders and those that have made this project possible, but we also wanted to give our own personal disclaimer slide. So what you're looking at is one of our local dams and levees here in Chattanooga. If anybody else is in the South, you might be experiencing an inordinate amount of rain, and we felt that that was really fitting for this presentation because we realized that we are going to be providing you all with a lot of information, and we feel like we've opened the data floodgates in our webinar today, and so we are more than happy to provide answers to any questions you might have, but we recognize that in this very short amount of time we are going to be inundating you with information, and so we'll try and be mindful. We welcome your questions, but of course if there's any need for follow-up afterwards, please contact us. So for those that may not be as familiar with ELERV, or what the longer phrase is Enhancing Law Enforcement's Response to Victims grant, just a little background for our department and for the project itself. This original grant comes from the Office for Victims of Crime, and then that money is given to the International Association of Chiefs of Police. It's then disseminated to 3 sites, of which we are one. We received this funding originally in October of 2015. And then, of course, in the picture you see the badges or the patches for our 2 partner cities in this endeavor. You see Casper Police Department and Saginaw Police Department, both of which have been wonderful sources of support for us through this entire process. And they too have been working at their sites really diligently since October of 2015. So for our department, this actually funded our very first professional social service provider, which is myself. So I've been with the department since almost the beginning of the grant. And it is actually what started a victim-oriented, victim-centered, and trauma-informed way of viewing services and of viewing policing here at our department. And so we are very grateful for this opportunity. I feel fairly certain that Chief Fletcher, who originally applied for and received this funding, would have found some way to bring victim services to our department in some way, shape, or form. But we're really grateful that it was through ELERV because of all of the wonderful things that you're going to see that Christie and our other research partner, Vic Bumpus, have brought to the table. It's important to note that ELERV really is broken down into 4 core areas, and this kind of guides and governs our work when we're looking at implementing the data that our research partners give us. And so the areas that they have it broken down into are in front of you, which is training. This includes everything from in-service, roll call trainings, all of our internal trainings that we roll out here. But it can also include external trainings, so things with community stakeholders, other advocacy agencies, working with our local educational institutions and communities of faith. So it's both internal and external. Leadership refers, when I conceptualize leadership in ELERV, a lot of it has certainly to do with the act of leading and setting a precedence for victim-centered work from the top down. But how this has really manifested itself and what you'll see is in a lot of emphasis on policy development. And if Chief Roddy were here, he would say that the words we document are the words that matter. And so the policies we have on the books, the practice, really kind of lead into the practices that we have out on the streets and in the services that we provide. And so you will see a lot of the policies that we've either revised or implemented as part of our ELERV project. You'll see performance monitoring is the next core area. It's exactly how it sounds, both internally, internal checks of how do we not just qualitatively monitor the progress of our program, but also of our people. We've tried to take the feedback and the data that Christie and Vic have given us and implemented that into performance monitoring within our own department. But then, of course, we have service provider feedback tools that we've utilized throughout this entire process, so that just because we believe we're doing a better job or perceive ourselves as doing a better job, it's really important what our key partners, as well as what community members and victims and survivors are saying about us or wanting us to hear from them directly. And so that's included in performance monitoring as well. And the last core focus area is partnering. And so that's everything from not just the MOUs that we have on paper, but the multidisciplinary teams that we participate in, the decision-making boards that we are a part of, that we might have a presence on, to how well we can partner and support our other law enforcement agencies in the area, and other social service providers. In year 1 of the grant, as I said, it started in October of 2015. I myself did not start at the police department until January of 2016. But we wanted to give you an idea of the progress that we made in year 1. And it really was just a way for us to get things started. And so we submitted a whole host of documents for the IACP to review for us, everything from policies, procedures, forms that we were currently using or not using or lack thereof, the presence of on-site services, again, or lack thereof. So they took a comprehensive look at our department and then made recommendations to us. From that, we developed our action plan, and then we began the implementation phase. In addition to this kind of flow chart that you see in front of you, it's important to note that while this was going on, we were also laying the groundwork for our victim services unit, which we believed complemented the ELERV goals and mission. So things like standard operating procedures, messaging to the department about how victim services is to be valued. You know, for example, Chief Fletcher and Chief Roddy placed my office right outside of theirs to set a precedence and a message from the top down that victim services is a valued member of the team here, which was incredibly helpful when we were getting things first started. Additionally, we hired 2 professional staff members through another grant to assist in actual direct service implementation to victims of crime. So we already knew at the very beginning that we had some gaps in service and we had a lot of areas for improvement. One specifically was around supporting victims and survivors of violent crime, family members that lose a loved one to homicide, shootings, aggravated assaults. We just knew that anecdotally to be true. And so we went ahead and realized we were going to in order for this truly to be a top-down innovation in our department and moving our department forward, I realized especially I was going to need more help than just me. And so our 2 original staff members are still with us today. I'm going to turn it over to Christie.
Okay. So as we move towards the baseline assessment, I think there's a couple of things that probably will not come as a surprise to many of you, but in trying to decide where we needed to start in our first year on the research side of it, we worked very closely with a steering committee that was developed out of the ELERV project. So it included a number of individuals from the police department, but also research partners, community partners. It was a good mix of expertise that really represented the multidisciplinary aspects of this project. And so that helped us somewhat, but also we were reaching back into the literature to see what it was that we needed to really understand better about victim satisfaction. And so one of the things that really struck out to me in the literature is that victim satisfaction with police has been well documented. It's not a new thing, but it only gained widespread coverage with the emergence of community policing. And so we wanted to kind of drill down a little bit on the accountability and effectiveness, where our officers are no longer just accepted by the community because they're reducing crime rates. They actually wanted to see more of this, what we call the development of modern policing strategies, where they've taken on less of a protecting orientation and going towards what has been noted in the literature as a business orientation. So in thinking about this and listening to our steering committee, we decided that the baseline assessment really needed to examine both citizen and victim perspectives on police services. It needed to also examine victim advocacy groups, perceptions of police services. So there, no police department is servicing the community on their own, and there are a lot of community partners there to inform this process, as well as exploring police internal perspectives on victims of crime. And so we might touch on this a little bit more in a moment, so I'm going to kind of gloss over that. And then the last one was utilizing information to develop appropriate action plans for more effective victim services. What we are going to really spend time on today, because I think it's important to note, this baseline phase was designed to be a mixed method strategy. So we wanted to have the quantitative data where we sent out surveys and saw the numbers of what folks were telling us, but more than that, we wanted to drill down into the story behind the numbers with the qualitative methods. And so I'm going to be talking more today about the qualitative, because that is the side that I was involved in and designed. And so with the qualitative side, we really looked at examining the victim's perspective, as well as using this information to develop our action plans moving forward. And you're going to hear more about that in terms of how we use the qualitative later with our cadets, going beyond the victims, because we learned a lot from our victims. So in the first year, as we were designing the focus groups, we wanted a good variety from our community. And so what we did is we looked at some demographic statistics that the Chattanooga Police Department provided for us, and we tried to be as proportionate as we could in our sample size. Now, qualitative, you don't do super large sample sizes, but we wanted it to somewhat represent the demographics we were seeing in our community. So with that said, we focused specifically on 5 special populations: African American or Black, Latino, Hispanic, elderly, and we chose to define that as 55 or older, and then the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community, and had a group specifically for victims of domestic violence or inter-partner violence. We felt that this was really going to help us to understand better how the police department was serving victims if we focused on these special populations. So the way that we went about our methods here, sorry, okay, make sure that you're, okay. We grouped folks according to the pre-selected criteria that I was just sharing with you. So each focus group, because we wanted to create a safe place for them to share, we grouped the African Americans and Black populations together. We grouped those who had experienced domestic violence together. We did not do a lot of cross-pollination with these special populations, and so that's what we refer to as a purposive sampling. We didn't necessarily predetermine our sample size. We sort of let that lead us, and it also was definitely dependent on time. It was very challenging to build trust in this process with the victims. So there was some fear, especially around the LGBT community and those who had experienced domestic violence. So we actually had to do a lot of groundwork in building that trust, and we had to partner with some of the community agencies that were already partners that had been identified by the police department, folks who served these individuals who had pre-existing relationships, so that we could create as safe a place for them to share and for them to understand that, for instance, that I am a neutral party, or the other moderators that came in or research partners are neutral and not connected to the police department. And so that ended up being more of a challenge than we anticipated. And just as a side note, it ended up being in some really interesting places. For instance, the first African American business in Chattanooga, we held a focus group in. It was a barber shop, and the barber, his name was Mr. Bear, and you know, the community trusts him. And so that's where we went. We went to the people where they were living and where they congregated naturally. And you know, I sat in a barber chair and talked to them for an hour before even being able to start the focus group. And so it was a very unique approach, but I feel like it helped us to get some better data and get some really honest answers as we were conducting these. So as a result of this, there was some snowball sampling that happened because folks would like refer others. You know, they would hear about this. We would get other people saying, hey, I know so-and-so, or, you know, there's a group of folks who have all lost family members or loved ones to gang violence. This is a very unique group of people, and they would love to share their experience as victims. And so that ended up being really helpful as we were conducting these qualitative focus groups. So to give you some idea, I mentioned the special populations, but we ended up with a pretty decent sample size for qualitative. We had 45 victims that we interviewed in these focus groups, that they were given the option to complete demographics. We actually have more data, but that is the number of folks who shared their demographics with us. I won't spend a lot of time here drilling down on who they were, but I will just say overall we had 65% female. So the majority of our participants who were willing to share were female. This was especially true in the Hispanic culture, which we were not surprised by. And then, of course, in the domestic violence, the same was true. We actually were not able to identify, unfortunately, a male victim. We know that they are there, but it was harder to get them engaged in this. And then as far as ethnicity and race, we had about 67% were Black, African American. And we had about the same number of white Caucasian as we did Hispanic Latino. And so that was also something that surprised us. The education of the group really ranged, but the majority of those who participated did not have a college education. So they either had grade school. We had several who did not get a high school diploma or GED. So that also gives you some idea of the demographics for our group. So, before I share some of the data that came from this first year and our focus groups, it would be helpful for you to know some of the things that we focused on when we asked them questions. We tried to keep our questions as broad as possible so that we would let them lead and remove, of course, our bias or anything that they might think that we want to hear. And so we asked things that was just, you know, tell us your experience with law enforcement. What was that like? And then we would just keep kind of drilling down. How would you describe how you were treated by law enforcement? Because we really wanted to hear the positive, because of course we want to bring back, like, keep doing this. This is what the community really wants you to keep doing, as well as where we can improve. So we tried again to say, just describe how you were treated. What went right in your interaction with law enforcement, but then what could have been improved? How familiar are you with resources available to victims of crime? Because the one thing that kept coming up as we worked with, really within the police department was we are giving resources, police officers would say, we are giving them resources when we work with victims of crime. And of course, the victims department was saying we really want them to, but we're not sure when we talk to our victims that they're receiving these resources. So we thought, well, let's ask them what the experience is. What do they hear? And before we get to the responses there, I do want to put a caveat. Most of the victims that they are interacting with, of course, are experiencing trauma in these processes. So the brain on trauma is different than just interacting with someone typically. So when we get to the discrepancy between what victims say and what the law enforcement was saying was happening, I think we also need to be mindful that there are very specific evidence-based interventions that need to happen when someone's experiencing trauma. So just put a pin in that. We'll come back to that in a moment. But we wanted to know if they were receiving these resources when interacting with a police officer, and then what resources were needed to improve the responses for future victims. You know, we were looking for what we could do moving forward. And that is what gave us the data from asking those questions. And I'm going to do my very best to fly through this because honestly, it was this first year that sort of has guided everything we've done since then. And what came, so when you see the little N there, that means 12, and if you remember, there were 45 participants with the focus group. So out of that number, the themes, which what we were looking for was a saturation of themes across all of these focus groups. So they remember many of them were not in the same room, and yet we got a very clear idea that some themes were really strong. And so one of those that I definitely want to highlight is that there was a strong sense of respect and positive reports from these victims. There were some who even went as far as to say, they saved my life. And so I think that's a really important thing to note, that there's some great work happening on the ground. And this is a quote from one of the participants. I've always told them, thank you so much, and you're so underpaid and underrespected. You all have such a scary job every single day. And then competence was a theme that was coming out. And competence was kind of a broad, we weren't sure, we had a hard time sort of defining what it was that people were saying. And then the more we looked and went back over our themes, we said, you know, really this is competence. And so this got into the resources. And they were saying, no, 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 I wouldn't dare ask, you know, my officer for a shelter. They don't know what resources are in the community. They've never shared them with us. I don't trust them to know. That came up with about 18 of our participants. And again, it was another strong theme. Then we got into perceptions regarding law enforcement. And they went a lot of different directions here. So they've interacted with, you know, law enforcement at a very vulnerable time in their lives. And so it triggered for them a lot of things. And for some, what they are interpreting this as we just need to be hiring better police officers. They need to be screened better because, you know, they're hiring people that don't know what they're doing. They're hurting people. This came up a lot, and that the community needed to have more input on these processes. Now, again, what that could look like, I'm not sure, but they felt that both the hiring and where officers were assigned in their precincts or communities needed to be more strategic. They felt a lot of the Black communities were expressing, we don't see Black officers in our community. We see them in areas that are primarily white demographic, and what has happened to us taking care of our own. And remember, victim satisfaction goes back to what we shared in the beginning, comes back to this notion of community policing. They really want to see the police officers in their communities interacting with them. And so to be able to identify that my officer looks like me kept surfacing. So that just that perception that they could trust them sometimes was based on, do they look like me? And then racial profiling came out, that there was this perception that the way they were treated was based on their race, not the fact that they were a victim. And especially there was a group, going back to the group I referenced earlier, who had lost loved ones to gang violence, talked about not being respected as victims because their loved one who had died had been involved in a gang. And so were they a victim or were they a perpetrator? And being dignified in that process was some of what was shared in these groups. Moving on to some big themes here. 45 participants again. We've got 25 prior perpetration. So if you had been, let's say you're calling in about domestic violence and there's a record that you have assaulted someone in the past, the victims who shared with us said that they would not get a response from law enforcement. They would not be protected. And that was a real concern. And it was leading to folks not calling the police because they didn't feel that they could trust being protected. And that sort of, we can almost combine those with this next one, the same prior negative interactions. And this came more from actually the LGBT community, where they just said we don't call them because if it's male on male domestic assault, there was stigma there and didn't feel a male needed the protection. And so they just wouldn't call, okay? And that sometimes overlapped with the prior one that I was talking about, but if they had negative interactions, they just didn't try again. And then also came just the defeat and the frustration. And I think this goes back to what it was saying about how hard it was to build trust and relationship and even having these conversations. As they said, people have asked us and our communities don't see what is done after we share. And so, you know, we said that's fair. And we really are hoping that we can be transparent in this process and that you'll see some evidence. But that was a really hard one. You know, they want to hear from us. They want to know what steps to action take, but when you actually have police cameras on that person inside the car and they see the video and they still don't act, what's the purpose? How can I ever feel safe? And then trust kind of goes back to why they're feeling so frustrated. The engagement between victims and police officers needs to be a little bit more, and that was something that we kept hearing. You know, I was taught to trust police officers, and unfortunately I've learned otherwise. So just that idea of trust. Power came up, but power came up in both positive and negative ways, and I thought that was really interesting. And you know, we know power is a neutral idea. It's just how you use it. And so I really like to show this because the inherent to this role is power, no matter how we look at it. And so let's talk about using that for positive. And we had several participants that shared examples. And the one here, I think if they knew how important then being there really is for someone to call and to need to be rescued from that situation, and for someone to show up and act concerned makes you feel so much better. It really is the difference between life and death, because that one encounter with that officer can make you want to change and actually stay away from that person and go to a shelter and get your life back together. If they honestly knew just how important that one thing really is. I thought that was a really powerful quote, and this individual did disclose how the officers saved her life, literally, from domestic violence. So, and then, of course, we talked about the negative use of power, and these themes gave us a really great launching pad to look and say, okay, what are we doing really well that we can continue to grow on, but what are some things that will help us be more responsive to the community? So that's where I will turn this over to Caroline to get us started in year 2, and you'll hear the direction we took with this data for the next couple of years. All right.
Great. All right. So as Christie said, taking everything from the year 1 data, we began to again, focus on those 4 core areas. And so all of our year 2 activities built upon what Christie and Vic brought to us once they had really kind of packaged everything, and it really gave us a roadmap moving forward. And so when you look at the training, leadership, and performance monitoring and partnering, you're going to see some examples. And some of this may be familiar to you all in terms of vernacular or acronyms, but a couple of examples of how I implemented what Christie and Vic brought to us was for training, we began to roll out you know, really soft training or just kind of dipping our toe in the water with our FTO meetings, which is field training officers. So they meet every couple of weeks here in our department, and at the beginning I was going almost every other time, or at least popping in, especially as I was building relationships. And so working with our FTO, because they are the ones that are reinforcing or doing what gets learned in the academy, working with our training staff on getting into the academy to work with building that foundation for our brand new officers from the ground up. And then, of course, roll call trainings. That was on a myriad of topics, and we'll get into some of those in another slide of what actual roll call trainings have looked like. Leadership, you see a whole slew of policies and procedures that either needed to be updated or fully implemented. For example, our hate crimes policy was woefully out of date, almost embarrassingly so. And so we had to update that to reflect current literature and statutes. So a good example would be in the state of Tennessee, unfortunately, members of our community, of our LGBTQ+ community, are not a protected class in the state of Tennessee, which is a challenge. And so we updated our policy to reflect the federal definition of a hate crime, so that included members of that community so that they feel safe and protected coming forward, and that we can work with our federal partners in the event that one of them is the victim of a hate crime. Another example would be our digital recording systems. That was actually not on our recommendation list from IACP. We fully implemented body-worn cameras, or as you see, digital recording systems, but we had to be really careful about how we crafted that, especially around issues of victimization. And so there are very clear and exacting procedures in that policy of when your body cam is to be activated, how it's activated, if a victim requires or requests that it is deactivated, settings in which you cannot have it activated, i.e. a hospital for, privacy practices. So we went ahead and just added that to our list of things that we wanted to implement in year 2. Performance monitoring, that again is that self-service provider feedback. And then partnering. So a good example would be we created a very specified MOU with one of our other educational institutions in town, the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, on sexually oriented crimes and what our department could do in support of their department. They actually have their own law enforcement agency on campus. They have their own police department that has all of the rights and privileges that being a sworn officer in the state of Tennessee affords them. And so, but there are certainly things that we could do to support them because of things like manpower or funding. We're, a mid-sized department, and they are a department of less than 20. So there are things that we can provide them that make sure that victims of sexual assault on UTC's campus are being supported through investigations. It's important to note that, for us and what we quickly realized is, as you just saw, we had this very great prescribed plan of this is what we're going to do in year 2. And you quickly realize that sometimes really great work and the work that we had set out to do is going to be halted by other work that is necessary and required of our agency. And so year 2, some of our work was just put on pause ever so temporarily because we experienced a mass casualty incident in our city where we had a bus crash where we lost 6 school-aged children with dozens others injured. And so what you're looking at was, one night where the whole city, it felt like, was gathered together. And for me as a service provider, it was my first time responding to a mass casualty incident or being in charge of trying to orchestrate a victim services response in light of that. And in keeping with some of the themes that Christie had talked about in terms of does our department reflect the community that we serve, and realizing too how important that is for our unit itself. We were serving a community that looks very different from me, myself personally, as a service provider, and really realizing that it's not just about cultural competency, but cultural humility when you're working with folks that may be from a different community, whether that be race, ethnicity, religion, creed, whatever that looks like. And so this was a huge moment for our city, for the families that we had the privilege of serving, but it really helped us in conceptualizing how we even move forward. Heaven forbid we have another large-scale incident, of things that we could do to improve upon providing quality care and services to those most deserving of it in that moment. I'll pass it back to Christie.
Okay. So I'm going to talk really fast for the sake of time. I know we need to move forward. As we started the next year, what we wanted to understand a little bit better as we talked again with the steering committee is, okay, so the victims have told us this is what their experiences have been. Where is this happening? When does it start? And so that puts us back at the beginning of this process, which is with cadets. And we really wanted to design this in a way that it could be longitudinal, if that's what we wanted over these next several years, to measure cadets as they are in academy and just get started, and then maybe 5-10 years, what is their perspective on serving victims. So we designed our next round of focus groups with cadets, and it really was to the success is owed to the support of the Chattanooga Police Department because they gave an hour and a half of time in the police academy, and have done so about 3 or 4 times now, built it into the academy where we could meet over lunch with the cadets and conduct these focus groups. So what I'm going to share with you today is just the first round of focus groups. We actually have lots more data to synthesize, which is going to be really rich and exciting. With our first 34 our first focus groups, we had 34 participants. These were predominantly male, 85% male, primarily white, about 79% white, 12% Hispanic, Latino, and so this was definitely a convenient sampling. As I just said, it was already built into the police academy, so it was different than going out and getting a random sample. But what we wanted to understand is, how would you define protecting and serving a victim? So we heard there's a little bit of bias against serving, for instance, someone who has been killed as a, it was in a gang and then later killed, who is actually a victim. We wanted to see if that's how, coming into this work, if they would have a broad definition of victim. And then we assess the importance of formal education and what we call soft skills training. So how much, those are things like empathy, training on communities, cultural competency or cultural humility, and how much would that help you in the role of community policing. So we assessed for that, and we also assessed for the utilization of support services for them. So we looked at, secondary traumatization from their exposure to all the things that they would see in work, and how would they implement self-care, and what they were doing currently and what they would do ongoing. And so what we found, and I'm going to synthesize this, when it came to defining victims, they really painted with a broad brush. They were like, everyone is a victim. Even one participant stands out and said, you could be a victim of circumstance, which was like, well, maybe not. But they really were able to, say, yeah, if you have committed domestic violence, for instance, and then you now find yourself being the victim of that, you're a victim. And so we heard that over and over. They also, in defining their role, they really took an empathic advocate role. That was a strong theme that came up from over half of our population sample. When we talked about formal education in order to do their job, if they felt that would be helpful, not surprisingly, about half, more than half. So out of 34, 24 said, well, it'd be valuable, but it should not be required. And so what we wanted to get down to then, well, what about trainings? And they really had a lot to say about trainings, which we're glad to hear because they have lots of trainings to do, that they found that inherently valuable and wanted more trainings. And they talked specifically about wanting trainings to help them to understand how to reduce racial profiling, for example, how to understand the demographics of the community that they would be assigned to. And so that, again, was more than half of the population. And then the support services, they really opened up about what they would need for support. And something Caroline and I have talked about that has a lot of implication for work moving forward is they don't want formal support. So, they don't necessarily find or benefit a lot from counselors, and many shared experiences with counselors. They need it in retired police officers, for example, or firefighters, people who can relate to the work that they have done. And some of them had identified that for themselves already, and some hadn't, but that was an overwhelming response that came from this group, that I think there's work to be done, that we respond to what they are saying they need rather than saying, here's an employee assistant program that we provide, call them and they'll help you, because they're saying that doesn't help them. So that's something we've sort of put a pin in as we move forward, so drill down into. But those were some of the themes, and I'm going to come back to these themes in a moment, because what it's really led to, you heard the training, and so after this year 2 of collecting data from cadets, we sat around the table again discussing, what do our policies look like? Are there ways that we, the data we've collected now from victims and cadets to inform better policies? What about our trainings? And Caroline spent a lot of time with the training department revamping training completely, and we have something very exciting we've integrated into training, but I will hold on that and pass this back over to Caroline, and we'll share with you a little bit about what we've integrated into training as we close today.
So as Christie said, we got some really interesting pieces of data back from our cadets themselves. And so this wasn't originally in our year 2 action plan, but these were some innovations that kind of came out of these really quick, tangible pieces of information that we were presented with from the cadet focus groups. And so one innovation that we embarked upon was called the Blue List, which is affectionately the name that we affectionately gave my personal initiative to get our officers to read more. And so we saw from them that they preferred education, but they wanted it from people in their own field, and that they wanted things that weren't explicitly from me per se as a victim service provider. So what we found was this beautiful blend of working with our local public library and getting officers to endorse books to one another, kind of like Amazon. It actually came out of an officer that endorsed this book on Facebook that I had been trying to get officers to read for months because it was so fantastic. And then he gets on there and he's like, hey, y'all should read this book. And everyone says, great, we'll read it. And so I actually had an entire set of them in my office. And so the next day, all of the ones that I had were already gone. And so we did this first round with the books Extreme Ownership, Fearless, and Ghetto Side. If you read Ghetto Side, which I highly recommend you do, John Skaggs was just at our department spending time with our homicide unit. And it's not just about investigations, it's how do you engage with families, especially around sudden and traumatic grief. So this is another way that we integrated different kinds of education, which we know education is incredibly helpful when we're looking at decreased instances of use of force, critical thinking skills. Education's important, but as our cadets were telling us, they don't necessarily want it in the terms of formal, 4-year degree or a master's degree. So that was really important. The next thing that we did with some of the cadet focus groups right away was we were working on peer support and wellness already, but we partnered again with IACP and Northeastern University, and we launched a vicarious trauma survey that they had already developed, and so we hopped in on that and were able to get really rich data from that and provided Christie and Vic with that as well, just so that they could see, because it kind of dovetailed into what they were doing. But one note about this is we included all of our staff in this, not just officers. I think, it's important to not forget your professional staff. They get forgotten a lot, and at least the perception is that they feel forgotten a lot. A good example was I was working one day and talking with one of our admins in an investigative unit, and I noticed that she was putting all of her paperwork in pictures face down into the file that she was preparing for the district attorney's office. And I just was curious, and I said, that's a really interesting way of preparing the file. Is that for a reason? Because I thought maybe she was looking at the numbers. And she said, no, it's so I don't have to look at the pictures of the crime scenes. And I'm sitting there thinking, holy cow, this woman has worked here for 20 plus years. I wonder how many crime scenes she's looked at, and has anybody ever asked her how she's feeling or what she needs in her job to be supportive? And so, professional staff, not just victim services, but other frontline staff, your front desk, your admin support staff, are exposed to a lot of the same sudden and traumatic details that our officers are. And so we included them and have now launched peer support and wellness all across. I'm seeing that some folks are having difficulty with audio. Can y'all hear us? Okay. Susan can hear. It's good on my end. Okay, thanks, friends. Okay. So it's really important to remember your professional staff because we want to support everyone that works in our department to be healthy and thriving in the work that we do. So moving on really quickly to year 3, again, we've broken it down by training, leadership, all those core areas. We launched into in-service. So I moved from just going to FTO meetings or going to roll call to teaching all 16 to 18 weeks of in-service in year 3. And we had an ongoing block and a cadet academy at this point. A good example of a roll call lineup was we did adverse childhood experiences training for all of our roll calls. So all of our officers are now trained in ACEs. And Chief Roddy himself is actually now a certified trainer for ACEs, and so he attended that training a couple weeks ago. We're going to talk about our community immersion in a second, so I'll skip past that. In terms of leadership, I'm on the policy review committee. I sit and review policy on a biweekly basis. And it's important to note that sometimes you may not think things are explicitly victim services, but there may be a place for us to plug in, and so that's what we found by me sitting on policy review committee. Performance monitoring. We began to incorporate VSU and ELERV principles into our promotional process. So this is that internal check that we decided to implement, not just with our external partners on how we're doing, but essentially what Chief Roddy wanted to do was incorporate ways to layer victim services principles and ELERV principles into award ceremony. So you're looking at our first 2 inaugural winners of our Victim Services Award, one for patrol and one for investigations, that now they can be nominated for every year during our annual award ceremony. But during our most recent promotions for the rank of captain, we had a couple of captain positions open up due to some retirement taking place in our department. And so during our captain's interviews, Chief Roddy asked them about our internal mission with victim services, how it incorporates into the work here, and how they conceptualize victim services in their own work, especially at the rank of captain, and how they plan to push that mission forward. And then for us in year 3, we were beginning to have to look at sustainability and growth through funding. We needed to look at, because we knew that our time with ELERV was going to be increasingly limited just by the nature of the project and what it was designed to do. So we ended up actually seeking city funding for my position. So I am now completely funded by the city of Chattanooga in the Chattanooga Police Department's full-time budget, which I don't know about your cities. I don't know what your jurisdictions look like, but getting full-time employees, FTEs written into a budget and approved by your city council or your county commission can sometimes be a challenge, not because they don't value it, but because it comes down to dollars and cents, right? But where your money is, your priorities are. And so we were able to achieve that last year, which also for me on a personal note is great for stability in my position. But we felt that to be really, really important moving forward.
Okay. So I mentioned the training and how the cadets brought up how valuable they felt the trainings were. And so in that process, I actually started researching how we could best train with an interdisciplinary model. So my background is social work, and we have their background in criminal justice and a very law enforcement. So what does this look like? It should not look like a social worker coming in as the expert, right? Because that's not the case. There are a lot of experts in the room. And I will tell you, the work to find the right training model is really hard. We did a lot of reading and talking and meetings and scrapping ideas and going back to, should it be case-based and what does this look like? And in one afternoon, I just sat down, I remember drafting out a long proposal, and I sent it to our advancement office and said, here is a proposal I have for training law enforcement on, all these different areas. And that turned into another grant that has come alongside of ELERV to supplement our training work, which then, a long story short, has turned into what we've landed upon, and is poverty simulations. So I've attended some trainings where they have shown how poverty simulations have been very effective in different settings. It really helps in interdisciplinary settings, but it has never been used in law enforcement. It's been used in all, medical fields, healthcare, social work, lots and lots and lots of different areas that has lots of empirical data behind it. And we searched and we searched, and I called the individuals who created the poverty simulation and said, what about with law enforcement? And they said, that's never been done, but we've always wanted to do it. So with this grant, what we were able to do is bring the folks who are from Community Action Network out of Missouri, who have the trademark on this poverty simulation that's been well researched. And we brought them out to do a 2-day training, and the first day was with our cadets. And this is actually built into the police academy. Again, it's the community immersion that Chattanooga Police Department has created, and they've added poverty simulation, which is 3 hours of training. Participants are exposed to 3 months of living in poverty and what that means and how to survive. And then we touched a little bit on the criminalization that happens for folks with who sometimes in poverty. Disproportionate numbers happen. And so what does this look like, and why, how does poverty impact crime happening? And so they spent 3 hours in this training, and it was very impactful. So what we actually have is some of our data from this first poverty simulation that took place, and we haven't done a full analysis. I looked at some of the raw data because we did a pre-post test model or design rather, and from all the numbers that I've looked at, there is definitely the numbers of understanding the issues addressed in this poverty simulation were higher. Everybody said, I understand more what poverty, how it impacts my community. I understand more what resources I can go to. I understand more the connection between race and poverty. And so that's the initial findings that we've had, but we are culling through that data and actually adding to it. In April, we'll be having our next poverty simulation with cadets to add to our sample and continue to see. So we look forward to bringing that data when we have it. But right now, we have been very excited to be able to partner with Chattanooga Police Department by integrating the poverty simulation into their training. So it is part of the culture of what, from the top down, Chattanooga Police Department is saying, this is really important. We value this enough that we're building it into our police academy, and that means a lot. It wouldn't mean much if I, as a social worker, was coming in and saying, here's what you need to know, but it's actually being built into the culture, and that's been huge. We could not have made the progress that we have so far without that support. So we're really excited that we've spent time making sure that we had something that could be effective when it comes to training, and are hopeful what this is going to mean moving forward. And again, we hope to come back to these groups of cadets in 5 years or so, and just see kind of what long-lasting impact the efforts we're making right now will have on them.
So as we wrap up year 4 and wrap up this entire project here at our department, we're continuing on with a lot of the same things that we've built upon in years 1, 2, and 3, incorporating the data that Christie and Vic bring to us as a continued way moving forward. And so, I'm in the throes of in-service right now, and for all transparency, this year's in-service has been a bit of a challenge. We tried, each year we try to do something different. And this year I worked with our SVU unit on victim-centered report writing and some of the language pitfalls that officers sometimes fall into, intentionally or unintentionally, more often unintentionally, around sexual assault reporting specifically. And it's been a challenge, I won't lie, this year, but at the same time, I've been encouraged and have felt uplifted by some of the really positive feedback that we've gotten. And so I can tell we're headed in the right direction. And so, but it's even, you know, being almost 4 years into the department and 4 years into this process, we still have a lot of challenges. They're usually in small pockets, and they're usually reserved to a couple of individuals that just might not be on board with the direction our department is headed in. But that, you know, I think that's to be expected everywhere. An example of something that we're doing policy-wise in year 4 is, and this is something that I was talking about that isn't necessarily traditionally victim services or blatantly victim services, but is our Op 17 policy, which is property. There are ways that we realized quickly that we were not going about property return in the most trauma-informed and victim-centered way. A good example that I have is I was accompanying the mother of a homicide victim to retrieve her son's wallet and car keys. And so, you know, perhaps in my own arrogance or just thinking we had it figured out, I thought, oh, me going down there is enough for her, right? And this was a huge moment of humbling for me and realizing that's not enough. Like, it needs, again, policy reworking and procedure reworking. It's not just the presence of victim services that needs to be at the table, but it includes other facets of your department. And so we're in our property division, and which is, you know, in a back building somewhere. There's fluorescent lighting. There's a cage that our techs stand behind for their safety, which I understand. But, you know, here I am with this mother who's wanting to reclaim her property for her son, which is the last things that he had on him before he lost his life. And we're treating it very clinically. Sign here, put your fingerprint there, get this copy here. Do you have your driver's license? And as our tech is going through the motions and doing their job, honestly, in all honesty, I look over and my mother has tears streaming down her face. And it was at that moment that I realized we need to do better. She deserves better, right? And so we're completely looking at revamping our property division, hopefully building out a private space where we can have families in a private, comfortable room and bring the property out to them, removing it from the evidence bag and presenting it to them in a trauma-informed way, offering to have items cleaned when appropriate, right, if there's biohazardous material. So, you know, it's victim-centered, it's victim-oriented, but it's incorporating all elements of our department. That is a way to involve our property division in the mission of our department. It's not just enough to have a victim services unit, and you don't have to have a victim services unit to have your agency be victim-centered, which is a big tenet of ELERV, is that you don't necessarily have to have victim services. It's great, but you can be a victim-centered agency just by how you go about these core areas. And then VSU specific for year 4, we are fortunate and very excited to be on the receiving end of another OVC grant through our Law Enforcement-Based Victim Services grant. And so that was a grant that we had applied for last year and received funding through OVC, which will allow us to bring in 2 additional staff members that are going to be focusing on patrol-related follow-up and out in the field response in real time for certain zip codes that experience a higher level of violent crime. So we're really excited. We're in the beginning stages of getting that process up and running. Really quickly, benefits and of our relationship with SAU and with our research partners. One thing that Christy and I both noted was that resource sharing was a huge outgrowth of this process, and I think Christy can chime in on her experience, but I personally have benefited from our network with SAU because we've started to attend events on campus. We just went to a wonderful and engaging presentation with a professor from the public health school at Harvard on racism and the impacts that that has on our physical health. And so there are now these things that are available to us just through this network that we have developed with Christie and Lauren at SAU and with Vic at UTC. And I don't know, Christie, if you have anything along resource sharing that you wanted to add.
Well, I think it's just like sharing about the grant that we got, you know, having another department that's looking at grants that might be able to sustain our work or carry it forward. Having a database to the library of empirical resources if we need more of that. I think just researchers and different types of expertise that help to inform what we're doing has been really rich in terms of research or in terms of resources. Yeah.
Sure.
The other thing that I think Caroline and I have talked a lot about is how none of us do our work, you know, in silos, and this has really put a spotlight on that. Many times law enforcement go about their work and no one really understands what they do except that they get scrutinized in public a lot. And for me, going into this work with a background in social work, honestly, I probably carried some bias into this process with me. And it's been a really rich experience of being able to put that aside, be a neutral participant, even sometimes work alongside and hear literally what they're doing and hear the success stories and how much they care. And being able to take that into a classroom where I'm now training future social workers and talk about how we reduce our bias through working with people and bringing respect and value and dignifying their processes and not believing we are the experts in every scenario. That's been incredible in terms of also increasing empathy and the reduction of biases, which we all hold at some level. And unless we're doing interdisciplinary work, I'm not sure that that we can actually reduce those. So that's been a benefit that I did not see going into this.
One thing for me that's been a huge benefit having Christie and Vic's data is it's helped me in making the case for victim services, if you will. So, you know, law enforcement, I had always worked with law enforcement prior to coming to the department. I had years of advocacy experience, but working in a law enforcement agency and then being expected to train them, you know, I had to make the case for why victim services mattered or what our role was here. And so, you know, for me, not just to say, here's the data, but to really put it in and couch it in the terms of this is evidence. Like, this is evidence just like we use in a case to establish, you know, probable cause. This is the evidence that says this is why victim services matter. So when I was able to juxtapose, you know, their perceptions of doing really, really well on Vic's survey of saying, yeah, we do a really good job of knowing resources in the community, and I feel confident in being able to refer someone you know, to an agency for some services. They answered really high when we did an internal survey with Vic, but then you saw Christie's data that said, no, I wouldn't know or I wouldn't ask an officer where to send me to for shelter. They don't know that. So I was able to say, you know, maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. I think our officers knew the information, but of course communicating it in a way to somebody that's experienced a traumatic event is something completely different. And so this for me was tremendously helpful when I went to go in and train and say, here's the evidence for my case. And this is why it matters, what we're doing and where we're going. With every benefit, there's also challenges, which I think are really important to talk about. And so, you know, Christie can talk more about this, but one thing that we were sharing when we were preparing for this was, you know, quantitative data is something that I think law enforcement is very familiar with, where they're used to, you know, I need a summary of that, I need a report, give me a heat map, crime analysis. I want the numbers. We have X clearance rate, decrease in this. And so quantitative data is a very familiar area, not just for law enforcement, but for a lot of folks. Qualitative data lends itself to vulnerability. And that can be really tough for all of us, especially for an agency that perhaps qualitative data is a relatively new occurrence for them. And it can be hard. I mean, I'm not going to lie. There were times where we were reading through our first year report and second year report when we had these, you know, focus groups, and you're reading some of these comments and your heart hurts a little bit because you're like, gosh, like, you know, the work that we thought we were doing that was really good might not have been so good, or perhaps, you know, it's kind of the idea of when helping hurts. And so that can be a challenge. It's not insurmountable, but it's something to be mindful of. But for us, Christie and I talked about, we believe that for our project, the qualitative data is where we've gotten a lot of richness in our project and been able to really implement a lot of innovative stuff that I'm not sure if we would have gotten to otherwise.
Absolutely.
Christie, do you want to talk about your comment of who's the expert?
Yeah, so I touched on that just a little bit, but I think it is really important to enter a room recognizing shared expertise. There were some things that I could talk about, really inform, maybe how they respond to victims, helping them to find resources, et cetera. But then there was some work, you know, in terms of what I want them to do to keep our community safe and understanding some of the data better than I did about different communities. And so giving that mutual respect goes a long ways, especially with law enforcement. You know, not in the same, like, I'm not expecting you to not also use your hard skills, like using a gun. I understand you need to be trained on that. That's important. I'm saying that the soft skills need to come along and enhance that and help you inform those processes. And it seemed like when we entered into that understanding and mutual reciprocity and mutual respect, that we were able to have some of these tough, vulnerable conversations that Caroline is referring to. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's been much richer because of that.
Yeah. And one last point in challenges would be keeping your momentum, especially during constant transition. So for those that are based in law enforcement or familiar with law enforcement, we always say the only constant is change. There is so much transition. You've got folks that promote, you have changes in administration, you have people that retire and replacements, you have people that leave the department to go and do work elsewhere. And so with that much change and transition, especially when you're working on something that is as meaningful as ELERV, you have to make sure that you're not only focusing on one core set of team, because Christie, Vic, and I and Chief Roddy are the only people from our original team that are still here. We've gone through different chiefs, we've gone through different captains and lieutenants, we've had folks leave the department and that were involved. And so while we had a core team of ELERV folks at the very beginning, I quickly realized that you have to also instill the values of ELERV and victim services in strategic pockets around your department, because especially for those, you know, for me, when I'm thinking of investing in professional relationships with officers, I want to make sure that I'm investing in folks too that are going to potentially be promoting, because they're going to continue to set the precedence for our department as we move forward. And so that surely is a challenge. Again, not insurmountable, but something that I wish I had been more mindful of at the beginning. And just in my own inexperience of working in a law enforcement agency, didn't know that that was potentially going to come into play as much as it did for our site. All right. Christie, do you want to reflect on anything, or do you want to go ahead and just move to Q&A? I know we've
I think our benefits really touched on it.
Sure.
The ones who have hung on with us through these last 20 minutes of overtime.
Great. So I want to remind people that you can enter your questions in the chat. If you want a private question, address it to host, presenter, panelist. For any question that you don't mind asking out loud, please ask it of all participants. If you are looking at your screen and the chat has disappeared because the exit poll is up, just find that chat icon, click on it, or the chat word, click on it, and the chat box will reopen. So the only question that I have seen so far is a credentialed domestic violence and sexual assault advocate who is looking to get connected to more opportunities to advocate. Caroline, you have been so inspirational. I think that more of us want to do the kind of work that you're doing. Do you have any advice for people?
Sure. I'm not sure if you, to the individual that asked the question, I'm not sure if you are currently working at an agency or if you're looking more to advocate with law enforcement. So, you know, community-based advocacy is really great. I started as a community-based advocate. I worked for a domestic violence and sexual assault agency here in town, and prior to that, I worked at one in Georgia. And so community-based advocacy is really great. But I'm now what's considered a systems-based advocate. And so that, I'll be honest, I think gives me a different level of access to the officers to advocate in a different way, simply because I always joke with them, I'm like, you can't escape me because I can walk into the squad room at any time and there I am, versus when, you know, I worked at the Rape Crisis Center in town, you know, I would have to rely on email or phone calls or seeing them at like a multidisciplinary team meeting. And so if you are community-based, I would say really hone your relationships with your local law enforcement agencies and do exactly kind of what Christie said, is to exercise your own empathy. I highly recommend doing ride-alongs with your local law enforcement. Most of your agencies should have a ride-along opportunity or a ride-along program. Everything looks different from a patrol car. And I have found too, sometimes when you're building relationships, it's easier to do that side by side than across the table. That can always be really intimidating. And so one day I had one of our officers tell me, you know, he said, I used to get afraid that I was going to offend you. And then we went and did a workshop together, and we had to work side by side. And I felt like our professional relationship grew that day because while we were working on tasks, it was just like more of a get-to-know-you time. And so things like ride-alongs, things like cross-training are incredibly important. But I want to be really mindful of the fact that I am able to do a lot of the things that I'm able to do simply by nature of where my office is located. And so, again, if you don't have the opportunity to work for a law enforcement-based victim services unit, building those relationships is incredibly helpful.
Thank you so much. We've had a couple of questions about your findings. First, and I guess this is to Christie as well as Caroline, have you disseminated the findings to the focus groups that you interviewed, and where can people find the data from your project to look at more closely?
Good questions. So that is next up. We have started, we've got a lot of this in writing and ready to go. It has not been published, and that is the next step. So we've had my research assistant, Lauren Souza, who has been fantastic on this project and has been there for every step of the way. We are working now to get that submitted to be published, and then we will definitely be able to disseminate that far and wide. Now, if folks want to email me specifically for some of this write-up, I would be happy to supply that. We do have, you know, some reports and things that we could share right now prior to it being published. So especially if it will help in any initiatives happening, we would love to share that. So
great. And did you get anything about your findings back to the focus groups who participated?
So that is a very difficult thing. And it is one that I have wrestled with because we cannot track, like I would love to do follow-up focus groups with them actually on some of the work that has been done. but locating those same groups. So I have been in touch with some of the main leaders, like the group with the gang violence I referred to. I've contacted some of them, and I have shared the findings. Or there's been a couple of times that the community has invited us to present at some local conferences and trainings, and I always contact the leaders in those communities and say, hey, you know, thanks to the help of your community and being able to share the information you gave, we'll be sharing ideas. You all are always welcome, and I invite them to give input to that. So it hasn't been, and Caroline, you feel free to jump in if you've found other ways that have made it more formalized, but actually tracking many of them, because some of the focus groups were done in shelters, like domestic violence shelters.
Yes.
So locating them is very difficult. So, but we certainly are doing all that we can in creative ways to make sure that they know that the data they have shared is being given back to the community.
I incorporate a lot of the findings every time I do a community presentation. So I don't just include it when I do in-service. So we have our elevator speech, so to say, for victim services when we go into a place of worship that wants us to come and present, or a school, or another agency, and I actually incorporate a lot of the findings, both quantitative and qualitative, that Vic and Christie have already, synthesized and finalized for us, and those are primarily year 1 and 2, as we're still working on year 3, and we're going to be doing another set of focus groups here in April. But so that's another way that, for transparency purposes, that we provide that feedback back to the community. We have plans at the end of the project just like we did at the very beginning, to talk about what ELERV is and what we're doing, is to host another community forum. We did that in year 1 with our year 1 findings, and we plan on doing that again, is to say this is what the project did, and to kind of close that feedback loop for the community, because that was something that, Christie, I don't think we mentioned this, but a lot of the families or individuals that we worked with in focus groups said, we're tired of being questioned and not seeing any action, or not ever knowing the results of that. So we really want to close the feedback loop. So every chance that we get to incorporate ELERV into presentations, City Council, every time we give a department update, we give it to City Council, and we include ELERV, even though they have nothing to do with ELERV in terms of funding. We report out on it so that it becomes institutionalized in the minutes, and there's a record of it as well.
That's great. I do want to remind people to please take the poll. Your feedback is very important to us. And Christie and Caroline, you're talking about getting information back to the community. A couple of your slides mentioned deliberately seeking community feedback, and one of the participants would like you to elaborate on that.
Well, and that's what I was going to add on to when we were talking about that before. If anyone has done some similar work like this and has had success in being able to get information back to the community, I would love to hear that. We knew going into this it was going to be a challenge, even when we asked them when they were sharing their fear of not hearing back how we could give it back to them. And some of them said, I don't want to read a report. So this is also the other tension that we're holding, is like we're talking, and it's part of why I love this project, because we're seeing implementation happen right away rather than it going on to a stuffy journal. And I'm saying that from an academia side, and it's sitting on a shelf and nobody reading it. So they said, we don't care what you write up and what your numbers show. Let us see the difference on our street. So also what we're assuming they want in follow-up looks different from what they're actually asking for. So I think, and this is why I wish I could circle back and actually ask them questions to see if they have seen or noticed any difference. The other thing we have to think about that's sort of a limitation in knowing, or the monitoring aspect of this, is we don't want them to be re-victimized, and so in order for them to have a different experience sometimes, would mean that they had an encounter with law enforcement.
Yeah.
And so how do we really measure the success of this and knowing if it's improved? And so this is really hard. And I think, and part of our design moving forward with research is why we said, how can we shift the culture of the agency? Because they have told us this, we need to talk to the cadets as they're coming in and continue to strive and effort towards a culture shift in the agency so that then not only does the agency change, the community sees and experiences those change in the way that they're asking for. So this is a tough one. It's got multiple sides to it. And again, I would love for robust discussion and ideas from folks who might want to, shoot us emails or ideas of work that they have done. And Caroline, you may want to add to.
Sure, and I see a clarifying question. So you're asking about the partner agency interviews. So Vic is that's part of his research side, and so he's actually in the process of re-interviewing everybody from the beginning of the project to now to say basically pre and post test, or I'm probably not using the correct terminology, sorry Christy, but basically saying like before and after, like prior to ELERV, a lot of them said, and I'm really generalizing Vic's data here, is a lot of them said, yeah, they do an all right job. They show up, they participate, but a lot of them expressed that our department did the minimum of what was required of us in terms of engaging them as partners. There wasn't anything proactive or innovative going on, but it was relatively similar to what Christy was seeing qualitatively with victims was, I appreciate the job that they do. So what we're hoping to see after Vic goes back to those original 15 agencies to re-interview them is that they would say that things hopefully have improved. I mean, that's what we're hoping for. So we'll have that information at the end of this year, and it'll be part of our final report that goes to IACP and OVC.
Yeah. Good clarification.
Mm-hmm.
That's super. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions, and we have gone well over time, so I just want to thank you both. This has been so informative and fascinating, and I really appreciate your time. I want to remind the folks that have been watching that if you would like a participant certification, if you need to show that you watched this webinar, please send a request to that's ASK, at victimresearch.org, and we'd be happy to send that certificate out to you. Again, you see our presenters' contacts here. We'll be making a recording of this webinar available in the next few days, and we'll send a link out to everyone who registered. So Christy and Caroline, thank you so much for your help today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.